All four of her husbands raised their hands against her. Every director she loved either broke her or dismissed her. And a studio chief took her to court in a foreign country and won. Bette Davis survived all of it. And then, before she left this world, she named every single one of them. William Wyler, the tyrant she could never quit. There is a particular kind of cruelty that arrives wrapped in genius, and Bette Davis understood it better than almost anyone who ever stood before a camera. His name was William Wyler, and by every reasonable measure, he was the greatest director she ever worked with. He was also, by her own documented account, the man who put her through a form of professional warfare unlike anything she experienced before or after. When Davis arrived on the set of Jezebel in 1938, she was already formidable. She had fought Warner Brothers for better material. She had taken roles other actresses refused because she understood that the character on the page mattered more than whether the audience would like her at the end. She had opinions, convictions, and a will that studio executives had spent years trying to break. What she did not yet have, what she would later say she found for the first time under Wyler's direction, was the complete realization of what she was capable of. Wyler's method was not gentle. Those who worked with him during that era documented his approach with a mixture of admiration and barely concealed horror. He was known throughout the industry as 40-Take Wyler, a nickname earned honestly, shot by shot, on productions where he would cut a scene and simply demand it again without explanation, without notes, without anything beyond the unspoken message that what had just happened was not yet what he required. Henry Fonda, who worked alongside Davis on Jezebel, recalled Wyler calling cut and saying nothing more than the word again, or offering the single assessment that it stinks. On the set of Ben-Hur, years later, his direction to Charlton Heston was reported to be 2 words: be better. This was not a man who explained himself. This was a man who waited until you found it yourself. And if you never found it, he simply kept waiting. On one particular afternoon during Jezebel, Davis completed a take she believed was among the finest work she had ever done. Wyler called it a cut, said nothing, let the silence sit in the room like a third presence, then said the word again. Davis did it again. He said nothing. Again. By the 40th take, what was left in the room was not frustration, but something closer to transformation, the particular state that comes from exhausting every instinct you trust and being forced to reach for something beneath them. That was what Wyler was after. That was what he always found. And Davis, who had spent her entire career reaching for exactly that unreachable thing, recognized it the moment it arrived. She just never expected it to cost this much to get there. This was the man Davis fell in love with. Because she did fall in love with him. Davis documented this without apology or qualification. She called Jezebel the time in my life of my most perfect happiness. She described Wyler as the love of my life. The film they made together that year, the story of a willful Southern woman who destroys herself and everyone around her through sheer stubborn pride, earned Davis her 2nd Academy Award for Best Actress. It is considered among the finest performances of the entire Golden Age, and it was made in an atmosphere of professional exhaustion, emotional intensity, and a personal entanglement that Davis would spend decades processing. They worked together 2 more times. The Letter in 1940 is considered by many critics to be among the finest films either of them ever made. A performance of such controlled precision that it still stops viewers cold more than 80 years later. Then came The Little Foxes in 1941, and the collaboration that had produced so much brilliance finally broke apart over a single artistic disagreement. The role was Regina Giddens. a ruthlessly calculating woman navigating a world of men who underestimate her at their considerable peril. Tallulah Bankhead had originated the character on Broadway, and Wyler encouraged Davis to model her interpretation on Bankhead's performance. Davis refused. She had her own understanding of Regina, her own sense of who this woman was beneath the calculation, and she was not willing to surrender that vision to replicate someone else's work. They argued. Davis walked off the set. She returned and completed the film. She did it, as she later wrote, his way, and she never forgave herself for it. Not because the performance was wrong, but because she would never know what the other performance might have been. In The Lonely Life, her memoir published in 1962, Davis chose a formulation that contains more complexity than any simple account of their conflict could capture. She wrote, "I did it his way. Yes, I lost a battle, but I lost it to a genius. So many directors were such weak sisters that I would have to take over. Uncreative, unsure of themselves, frightened to fight back, they offered me none of the security that this tyrant did." Read that sentence again. She called him a tyrant and in the same breath said that working with him gave her security. She acknowledged losing a battle and simultaneously told you she would rather lose to him than win against anyone else. This was not the language of someone who had moved past the experience. This was the language of someone still living inside it. After The Little Foxes, Wyler never directed Davis again. Davis kept working, kept fighting, kept delivering performances that audiences and critics marveled at. But she never stopped believing that something had been left unfinished. The wound of it never fully closed. It simply became part of who she was. By 1959, Davis's fourth marriage was deteriorating, and her film career had entered a quieter period. She made her way to the set of Ben-Hur, where Wyler was directing one of the most ambitious productions in Hollywood history. Those close to her at the time suggested she arrived hoping for something. A recognition, a warmth, some acknowledgement of what they had been to each other. What she received was courtesy. Wyler greeted her pleasantly and distantly. As one greets an acquaintance one has not seen in some years and does not expect to see again. His indifference was more wounding than any argument they had ever had on a set. She had crossed an ocean for him twice in her life. He offered her small talk. In 1982, appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, Davis mentioned that she had begged Wyler to come out of retirement to make one final film with her. He declined. He passed on in 1981, and the film that Davis imagined for them remained unmade. The last collaboration she ever wanted was the one she never got. What she said, in her own careful language, was that losing to a genius was preferable to winning against someone who asked nothing of her at all. Wyler's method demanded everything. His distance took the rest. And Davis, who gave everything to everything she ever did, considered that a fair exchange. That is perhaps the most revealing thing she ever said about herself. Errol Flynn, the most beautiful man who couldn't be bothered now. Consider the distance between William Wyler, who demanded perfection across 40 takes and still could not bring himself to tell Davis what he wanted, and a man who openly confessed he had no idea what he was doing and seemed to find the admission faintly amusing. Errol Flynn was, by nearly every account, the most physically magnificent presence Hollywood produced in its golden age. He was also, by his own cheerful admission, not an actor in any serious sense of the word. Davis said it plainly and on the record more than once. He openly said he didn't really know anything about acting, she told interviewers. And I admire his honesty because he was absolutely right. In a separate account, she offered this. He was not an actor of enormous talent. He would have admitted that himself. But in all those swashbuckling things, he was beautiful. Beautiful. It is a word Davis did not deploy carelessly, and she used it for Flynn without apparent irony. She recognized something genuine in him, a quality of presence that the camera adored and that audiences responded to with a devotion no amount of craft could manufacture. She simply had no patience for the fact that he treated this gift as sufficient, that he never felt any obligation to develop it into something more deliberate. Where Davis arrived on set, having studied every line, every motivation, every physical choice her character would make, Flynn arrived. That was the full extent of his preparation. He arrived, and somehow, maddeningly, the camera loved him for it. They made 2 films together at Warner Brothers, The Sisters in 1938 and The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex in 1939. Davis received second billing on The Sisters, despite having spent nearly a decade building her standing at the studio through sheer force of professional will. And despite the fact that Flynn's contribution to the art of acting was, by his own assessment, negligible. This was the arithmetic of the studio system. Beauty and box office ranked above excellence and sacrifice. And Davis understood it without accepting it. She had gone to court for her craft. Flynn had never once considered that his craft was something worth going to court for. Flynn, for his part, was not unaware of Davis's opinion of him. He documented his own perspective with a candor that, in its way, matched hers. Bette was a dynamic creature, he wrote, the great big star of the lot, but not physically my type, dominating everybody around, and especially me, or trying to. This drove me off. There is something almost admirable in the symmetry of their mutual assessments. She found him beautiful and talentless. He found her formidable and overwhelming. They agreed, essentially, that they were entirely wrong for each other. The working relationship reached its definitive endpoint during the production of The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex. Davis played Queen Elizabeth I, a role requiring the full deployment of her technical skills, her emotional intelligence, and her willingness to make herself physically unrecognizable in service of the character. Flynn played the Earl of Essex. At some point during filming, in the course of a scene requiring physical confrontation, Davis struck Flynn with genuine force. She was not playing a stage slap. She connected. What happened next lasted less than a second and ended everything between them permanently. Flynn struck back at her. Not a controlled stage movement, not a reflexive stumble. He lashed out at her on a film set in front of a crew in response to a woman who had simply done what the scene required. The room went silent in the way rooms go silent when something has happened that no one quite knows how to process. Davis held whatever expression she was holding. The camera, if it was still running, captured it. And then the moment passed, as moments do, into the specific silence of things that will never be discussed on the record by the people who witnessed them. They completed the film. When it ended, Davis and Flynn never spoke to each other off camera again. No reconciliation, no acknowledgement, no resolution. The professional relationship simply concluded, as decisively as if a door had been closed and the key thrown away. Whatever had existed between them, the mutual irritation, the professional friction, the specific chemistry that 2 entirely incompatible people sometimes generate simply by being forced into the same room, ended on that set and stayed. What makes Davis's account of Flynn something more than a simple dismissal is the specific nature of her complaint. She was not angry at him for being untalented. She was not contemptuous of his success. She documented something more precise. The particular frustration of a woman who had sacrificed so much for a standard of professional conduct that her co-star found entirely optional. The craft she had gone to court for, the craft she had endured 40 takes to serve, meant nothing to Flynn. Not because he was cruel about it, but because it simply never occurred to him that it should. And yet, she called him beautiful. She noted his honesty. She acknowledged, without quite admitting it, that he possessed something that could not be taught and could not be manufactured. Her contempt was precise, and her admiration was equally so. And the combination tells you something important about the way Davis saw the world. She could despise what a man failed to bring and still recognize what he brought anyway. That capacity for honesty, even when it complicated her own position, was perhaps her most defining quality. Michael Curtiz, the director who looked right through her. The next man could not be accused of Flynn's cheerful indifference. He was serious, driven, and responsible for some of the most celebrated films in Hollywood history. What Bette Davis documented about Michael Curtiz was something else entirely. A blindness so complete it amounted in her accounting to a kind of professional contempt. Curtiz directed Casablanca. He directed Yankee Doodle Dandy. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most accomplished directors of the studio era. He directed Davis in The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex in 1939, and in The Lonely Life. Davis named him specifically, alongside John Ford, Mervyn LeRoy, and George Cukor, as directors who had dismissed her confidence and her instincts because they were accustomed, as she put it, to empty, passive slates they could scribble on. That phrase, empty, passive slates they could scribble on, is one of the most illuminating things Davis ever said about the golden age she inhabited. She was not describing incompetent directors. She was describing highly accomplished men who had built their reputations working with a particular kind of performer. The kind who received direction and executed it, and brought nothing that had not been specifically requested. These men had learned to work with instruments. Davis was not an instrument. She was a collaborator, and the distinction, she discovered, was one that several of Hollywood's most celebrated directors were entirely unprepared to navigate. On the set of Elizabeth and Essex, this dynamic made itself known early. Curtiz arrived with a vision of the scene and expected Davis to inhabit it. Davis arrived with her own vision of the scene and expected to discuss it. The conversation that resulted was not a discussion. Curtiz wanted compliance. Davis offered collaboration. To a director who had spent his career reading compliance as professionalism, collaboration read as difficulty. And so he treated her as difficult, which is to say, he stopped listening to her. And the performance that might have existed in the space between his instincts and hers was never made. It remained, as Davis would have understood it, a ghost of something that should have existed but didn't. Because one person in the room refused to see what was standing directly in front of him. Davis had a theory about this, and she articulated it with the precision of someone who had thought it through over many years. The directors who took her seriously, who argued with her, who pushed back, who treated her creative instincts as a resource rather than an obstacle, were the ones whose films with her became something greater than either of them could have produced alone. Wyler was the supreme example. Edmund Goulding, who directed her in Dark Victory, understood it. Joseph Mankiewicz, who directed All About Eve in 1950, understood it so completely that he later said she was syllable perfect, that working with her was every director's dream. These men engaged with what Davis brought. They were better for it, and so were their films. Curtiz wanted the slate. He got the woman who had just sued his studio for the right to choose her own material. The friction was structural before it was ever personal. Now here is the part of the Curtiz story that Davis could not have fully anticipated when she wrote about him in 1962. and it is too important to move past quickly. After his difficult experience with Davis, Curtiz went on to direct Joan Crawford and Mildred Pierce in 1945. Crawford's performance, steely, sorrowful, and immensely controlled, is considered one of the finest of the era. It earned Crawford her only Academy Award for Best Actress. And Crawford brought to that role something unscripted, something personal, something that Curtiz initially resisted and ultimately could not deny. Think about what that means. The passive slate he had preferred over Davis's collaboration turned out to be a fantasy. The strongest performance of his later career, the one that history remembers him for after Casablanca, the one that sits at the top of every discussion of his artistic legacy, came from a woman who, like Davis, insisted on bringing herself to the work. Curtiz had dismissed Davis for exactly the quality that Crawford ultimately gave him. The lesson Davis had been trying to teach him on Elizabeth and Essex was the lesson Crawford taught him 6 years later, on a different film with a different result. Davis was right. Curtiz eventually proved she was right, and she received none of the credit for the education. History gave Curtiz the masterpiece. Davis got the argument that made it possible. Davis's complaint about Curtiz was not simply that he had been unkind to her. It was that he had failed to understand what an actress like her was for. The directors who looked past the image to the instrument inside it always made better films. The ones who couldn't see past their own expectations settled for something lesser. Curtiz settled for something lesser with Davis. The record shows he eventually learned better, just not with her, and not in time for her to benefit from it. Ham Nelson, the man who made her pay for her own success. Curtiz dismissed what Davis brought to her work. The next man dismissed something that belonged to her far more fundamentally than any performance could. And Davis documented what he took from her with a plainness that still carries the weight of everything she chose not to say around it. Harmon Oscar Nelson Jr. was Davis's first husband, and he came from before Hollywood, from the life she had lived before the cameras and the contracts and the fights with studio chiefs. He was her high school sweetheart, a musician who had known her when she was simply a girl from New England, with ambitions too large for anyone around her to quite believe in. He followed her to California. He waited while she built something extraordinary. And then, when the extraordinary thing she had built turned out to be larger than him, the waiting curdled into something else. Davis and Ham Nelson, as he was known, were married in 1932. She was 24 years old, and by her own admission in The Lonely Life, a young woman who had never been with anyone on her wedding day. A detail she offered not for effect, but because it was true, and truth was what her memoir was built on. The early years of their marriage coincided with the early years of her ascent at Warner Brothers, and for a time the two things existed alongside each other without apparent conflict. She worked. He worked. She began to be noticed. She began to be more than noticed. The problem, as Davis documented it, was not that Ham Nelson was a cruel man in any premeditated sense. The problem was that he was a man of his era, which meant he had an understanding of what a marriage was supposed to look like and what a wife was supposed to be within it. That Davis's career was systematically demolishing. She was becoming, by the mid-1930s, the most important actress at one of Hollywood's most powerful studios. He was a musician whose career, while respectable, did not occupy the same plane. The distance between their professional standings widened with every film she made, every award she received, every contract dispute that put her name in the newspapers as a woman who would not be managed. And with every widening of that distance, something in Ham Nelson hardened into something she could no longer reach. The resentment that grew from this dynamic expressed itself in multiple ways. All four of her husbands, she wrote, ultimately raised their hands against her. She placed this observation in her memoir without dwelling on it, without constructing a scene around it, without asking the reader for any particular response. It was simply a thing that had happened, documented because it was true. 4 men, 4 marriages, the same pattern, playing out across 2 decades, as if the institution itself had decided that Bette Davis needed to be reminded of something it could never quite make her believe. But beyond the physical dimension, Davis also recorded something Ham Nelson did that fell into a different category of harm entirely. He forced her to end a pregnancy she had not chosen to end. Davis documented this in her memoir directly, without evasion, without the softening language that the era might have permitted her. Ham Nelson, faced with the prospect of a child, made clear that this was not something he would accept. He said so plainly, and he did not relent. And Davis, who had fought a studio in a London court and walked away in debt, rather than surrender her professional autonomy, who had stared down 40-take directors and refused roles that insulted her intelligence, found herself without the power to protect something far more personal than any of it. She named this. She did not ask you to react in any particular way. She named it and moved forward, because she had learned, somewhere in the architecture of her New England upbringing, that what you survive becomes part of what you are, rather than the definition of what you were. The marriage ended in divorce in 1938, after 6 years. Ham Nelson went on with his life. Davis went on with hers, and the going on produced some of the most extraordinary work in the history of American cinema. Dark Victory, The Letter, The Little Foxes, now Voyager, all about Eve. The woman Ham Nelson had tried to diminish by controlling what she carried in her own body went on to become exactly what she had always been going to become. His resentment changed nothing about her destination. It only altered what she carried on the way. Davis once said that her passions were all gathered together like fingers that made a fist. Drive is considered aggression today, she observed. I knew it then. Somewhere inside that purpose, one suspects, was the knowledge of what she had been through, and the determination that it would never be enough to stop her. William Grant Sherry, the man who raised his fists. Ham Nelson's cruelty was the cruelty of a small ego encountering something too large to contain. The next man's conduct was simpler, more direct, and in its way even harder to account for, because William Grant Sherry had no professional rivalry with Davis to explain away. He simply could not live with who she was, and he chose to express that inability in the most direct way available to him. Davis met William Grant Sherry at a cocktail party in Laguna Beach in 1945. He was a former Marine turned artist, 7 years younger than she was, and entirely outside the Hollywood world that had consumed her for 15 years. Those who observed their early courtship noted that Davis seemed genuinely enchanted by this, by someone who had his own identity, his own work, his own frame of reference, that had nothing to do with box office figures or studio contracts or the delicate politics of the Warner Brothers lot. She had been married to a musician who resented her success. She had been briefly married to businessman Arthur Farnsworth, who passed away suddenly in 1943 while walking down a street in Hollywood, collapsing from a previously untreated injury. She had known loss and resentment and the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been fighting for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like not to. She was ready, it seemed, to try again with someone who belonged to a different world entirely. Someone who would see her rather than what she represented. The marriage that followed told a different story. Davis documented in The Lonely Life that Sherry's resentment of her career and the income it generated expressed itself through physical force. He was volatile, A man for whom the disparity between his wife's public prominence and his own standing proved impossible to absorb without consequence. Davis had her only biological child during this marriage. Her daughter Barbara Davis Sherry, known always as BD, born in May of 1947. The arrival of a child into a marriage already under such strain added weight to a structure that was not bearing its existing load. What Davis did with this experience in her memoir is as instructive as the experience itself. She documented it plainly as a matter of record. She offered no extended analysis of why Sherry behaved as he did. No psychological portrait of what his childhood or his military service or his artistic ambitions might have contributed to the man he became in private. She simply stated, in her memoir published in 1962, that this was part of her marriage to him. The flatness of the prose is not emotional distance. It is the particular composure of a woman who has decided that the facts speak adequately for themselves. She had learned by then that the most devastating thing you can do with a truth is simply say it plainly and let it stand. She was the first woman to serve as president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. She co-founded the Hollywood Canteen, which entertained hundreds of thousands of servicemen during the Second World War. She fought for and secured better material, better directors, and better compensation than any actress of her generation had been able to obtain. She did all of this while navigating private circumstances that the public, reading about her battles with Jack Warner or marveling at her performances on screen, had no knowledge of. The woman they saw on screen, fierce, unbreakable, entirely in command of every room she entered, was the same woman who came home to something entirely different. Both of those women were real. Davis never asked for credit for holding both of them together. The marriage to Sherry ended in divorce. Davis later said she believed in marriage completely and had never entered one without believing in it entirely. That belief, tested 4 times, perhaps 4 times too many, never quite broke. And the fact that it never broke, that she kept believing, kept trying, kept opening herself to the possibility of something she had never quite managed to find, is perhaps the most human thing about her. Robert Montgomery. The name she refused to explain. There is a particular quality to silence from someone who never stops talking. Bette Davis, as those who knew her well understood, did not withhold. She was named Crawford. She was named Hopkins. She was named Warner. She named the directors she found inadequate, and the co-stars she found insufferable, and the husbands who had failed her in every way a husband can fail a wife. She offered opinions about the living and those who had passed and everyone in between, and she stood behind every word. Which is why, when she was asked in a recorded 1972 interview about Robert Montgomery, what she said, or more precisely, what she chose not to say, remains, half a century later, more arresting than anything she might have offered if she had simply answered the question. Montgomery was, to the audiences of the 1930s and 40s, the embodiment of a certain kind of Hollywood leading man. Charming, polished, impeccably mannered, possessed of an ease before the camera that made everything he did look effortless. He came from genuine wealth, which gave him a quality rare in Hollywood, a sense that the whole enterprise was something he had chosen rather than something he needed. He was respected by his peers. He was beloved by audiences. He was, in short, exactly the kind of figure against whom no reasonable accusation would seem to stick. The kind of man whose reputation functioned as its own protection. Which is precisely what makes what Davis did not say about him so impossible to set aside. Davis and Montgomery worked together, and something happened between them that Davis, uniquely, declined to describe. In the interview, Davis was asked about her history with Montgomery. She paused, and then she said this: We had an unfortunate experience. Yes, some stories. I feel it's our private family business. We did not get along, no. But I think that Mr. Montgomery had a smashing career, and I'm not going to sit here and say what I think. Consider the architecture of that response. She confirmed there was an experience. She confirmed there were stories. She declined to tell them. She chose the phrase private family business, a formulation she used nowhere else in any documented interview. A phrase that carries specific domestic weight, suggesting something closer and more entangled than a simple professional disagreement. And then she said something that functioned as its own small answer. She said she was not going to sit there and say what she thought. Not that there was nothing to think about. Not that it was unimportant. She simply chose, on this occasion, and apparently on every occasion before and after it, not to say. Davis spoke critically of people who had passed on without apparent discomfort. She was not someone for whom social convention or the respect typically accorded to those no longer with us functioned as a restraint. And yet Montgomery's name remained throughout her life. In this particular category of things she would acknowledge, but not illuminate. She had named men who had done far worse in far more public ways. Whatever Montgomery had done existed in a category she had decided, for reasons entirely her own, to leave sealed. Montgomery's daughter, Elizabeth Montgomery, who became one of television's most beloved figures through her role in Bewitched, later established a friendship with Davis. Elizabeth was aware of the difficulty between her father and Davis, aware that it was real and documented, and navigated that awareness with a discretion that mirrored Davis's own. Two women, a generation apart, both carrying knowledge of something neither of them chose to put into words, and both choosing, independently, the same silence. The silence Davis maintained about Montgomery marks the outer boundary of what she was willing to do. She would name you. She would quote herself naming you. She would repeat the naming across 5 decades with no apparent concern for your feelings or your reputation. When she stopped, when she chose the phrase private family business and then closed the subject permanently, she was marking a line only she knew the location of. What the silence tells us is this: Davis understood that naming something could be an act of power, but she also understood that not naming something could be an act of greater power still. She had already said enough. The shape of what she declined to say does the rest of the work, and will go on doing it for as long as people pay attention to her words. If you have a theory about what Davis was protecting, or what Montgomery did that she would never say out loud, put it in the comments. This community has surfaced things on past videos that no one expected. Let's see what you know. Jack Warner, the studio chief she sued and outlasted with Montgomery. Davis chose silence. With the next man, silence was never an option, because he had summoned her to a courtroom and she had no choice but to answer. In 1936, Bette Davis did something that no major Hollywood star had done before her, and almost none would attempt after. She walked away from the most powerful studio in the industry, boarded a ship to England, and announced her intention to work independently of the contract that Warner Brothers considered legally binding, and she considered an instrument of professional captivity. Jack Warner's response was to take her to court, and the story of what happened next, the London courtroom, the ruling against her, and everything that followed, is perhaps the most important story in the entire history of the American studio system. To understand what Davis was fighting, you need to understand what the studio system was. In the 1930s, major studios did not merely employ actors. They owned them, in every practical sense of that word. A contract was not an agreement between parties with mutual obligations. It was a document that gave the studio the right to assign you to any film they chose, suspend you without pay if you refused a role they selected, and extend your contract by the length of any suspension, effectively trapping you indefinitely. The studio could also loan you to other studios without your consent, for fees that went into the studio's accounts rather than yours. Stars who objected were suspended. Stars who were suspended found their suspensions lasting longer than their original contracts, because every day of suspension added to the clock. It was, as Davis understood it, a system designed to ensure that the valuable thing, the talent, remained permanently under the control of those who had no talent but considerable capital. Davis had been at Warner Brothers since 1932. She has won 2 Academy Awards. She had made the studio considerable sums of money, and she had been rewarded, in her view, with a series of roles that insulted the standards she held herself to. She said it plainly in every subsequent account. I knew only good directors and good scripts could give me a career. I couldn't do it with junk. When Davis refused a role she found beneath her, Warner suspended her. When she accepted an offer to work in England, Warner took her to court. He expected her to come back quietly, accept the terms, and return to being profitable. He had badly misread his actress. The case was heard in London in 1936. Davis was represented by Sir William Jowett, who argued on her behalf with genuine conviction about the fundamental injustice of a contract system that gave one party absolute power over another's professional life. Warner's legal team argued that Davis had entered into a contract and was obligated to honor it. The presiding judge ruled in Warner's favor. Davis was ordered to return to Hollywood, found herself in considerable debt from the legal proceedings, and came home having lost the case entirely. She had crossed an ocean, stood in a foreign courtroom, and staked everything she had built on a principle. The principle was right. The ruling went against her anyway. What happened next is the part of the story that the headline version consistently underestimates. Davis returned to Warner Brothers and over the following decade delivered the greatest sustained run of performances in the studio's history. Dark Victory in 1939, The Letter in 1940, The Little Foxes in 1941, Now Voyager in 1942, Mr. Skeffington in 1944, All About Eve in 1950. Warner, the man who had taken her to court, found himself distributing and profiting from the work of the woman he had tried to own. The actress who had lost the legal battle proceeded to win everything else. And then, in 1944, something happened that Davis could not have anticipated when she first boarded that ship to England. Actress Olivia de Havilland, Davis's colleague at Warner Brothers, brought her own legal challenge against the studio system. De Havilland's case succeeded. The ruling that resulted, which became known throughout the industry as the de Havilland Law, established that studios could not extend an actor's contract by the length of a suspension, dismantling the most punishing mechanism of the very system Davis had challenged 8 years earlier. The legal argument that Davis had first made in a London courtroom, at considerable personal cost, with no guarantee of anyone following her. That argument had now been vindicated by the courts. The victory was named for someone else. The courage had been Davis's first. She said she did not regret one professional enemy she had ever made. Jack Warner was among the most powerful professional enemies any actress of that era could have chosen. She outlasted him at his own studio, left in 1949 on her own terms, and spent the rest of her career being precisely the kind of artist that no studio contract could ever have contained. If you haven't subscribed to Golden Age Files yet, do it now. What remains on this list includes a name at the end that will reframe everything you've just heard about who Bette Davis really was. Gary Merrill, the husband who couldn't become Mr. Bette Davis. The set of All About Eve in 1950 was, by the account of almost everyone present. A production of remarkable creative energy. Joseph Mankiewicz had written what Davis herself called the best script she had ever read. The story of an aging Broadway star whose supremacy is challenged by a young admirer, whose devotion turns out to be something entirely more calculated and more dangerous. Davis played Margot Channing, and the performance she gave, withering, funny, sorrowful, and finally, unexpectedly gracious, is considered by many to be the finest of her career. It earned her another Academy Award nomination. It produced the line that became perhaps the most quoted in the history of American cinema. "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night." And on that set, Bette Davis fell in love with her leading man. Gary Merrill was an actor of genuine ability and genuine charm, and the romantic connection between him and Davis was, by all accounts, immediate and real. They married the same year the film was released, and Davis did something that surprised people who thought they understood her. She moved. She left Hollywood, the city and the industry that had defined her for 2 decades, and relocated with Merrill to Cape Elizabeth in Maine, a small coastal community as far from the Warner Brothers lot as geography could provide. She was trying to build a life that looked different from the one she had been living. She was trying to give marriage, for the 4th time, a genuinely fair chance. She planted a garden. She cooked. She drove her daughter to school. She tried, with everything she had, to be something other than Bette Davis for a while. The woman who had fought every institution Hollywood possessed was willing, for love, to try something quieter. They adopted 2 children together, Michael and a daughter named Margot. It was discovered in time that Margot had been born with significant developmental difficulties that would require institutional care and the particular grief that accompanies the realization that a child's needs exceed what a family can provide at home. Davis faced this with the same composure she brought to everything. Not without pain, but without the collapse that pain might have excused. The marriage itself, however, was deteriorating in ways that Davis documented in both The Lonely Life and her later memoir, This and That. Merrill's relationship with his wife's greater fame proved, over time, to be as corrosive as the same dynamic had been in her first marriage. He was a talented actor who worked steadily, but he was not Bette Davis. And in a marriage to Bette Davis, this distinction had consequences. Those who knew them during the Maine years recalled a household in which the tension between Davis's professional identity and Merrill's sense of his own were a persistent presence. Davis documented that the physical conflicts that had characterized her earlier marriages were not absent from this one either. She wrote, with the contained precision that was her memoir's register, "But they all settled, my husbands, and enjoyed the fruit while they tried to cut down the tree." That sentence does more work than most paragraphs. It describes not one marriage, but a pattern in which men were drawn to what Davis was, and then, once close to it, threatened by the same quality that had drawn them. They wanted the fruit. They resented the tree that produced it, and their resentment expressed itself in the most direct language available to them. The marriage ended in divorce in 1960, after 10 years. Davis filed the papers. The court battles over visitation rights for their adopted children continued for 4 years beyond that. 4 years of legal proceedings, of her name in courtrooms again, of fighting for something she had believed in completely and watched deteriorate anyway. And then, 2 years after the divorce, Davis made a film that answered every man who had ever tried to diminish her with the most definitive language available to her. The work itself, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, released in 1962, paired Davis with Joan Crawford in a production that every major studio had declined to finance, on the grounds that 2 actresses of their age and standing were not a commercially viable proposition. Davis's performance as Baby Jane Hudson, a former child performer trapped in the wreckage of her own delusion, earned her the final Academy Award nomination of her career. The tree was still standing. It was still bearing fruit, and every man who had tried to cut it down had run out of time. When Davis looked back on her 4 marriages, what she offered was not bitterness exactly, but something more precise. She said, "Gary was a macho man, but none of my husbands was ever man enough to become Mr. Bette Davis." It is the kind of line that makes people laugh when they first hear it, and then doesn't quite leave them, because underneath the wit is a genuine sorrow. The sorrow of a woman who wanted, more than almost anything, to find someone equal to what she was, and who kept discovering that the search was more expensive than she had budgeted for. Alec Guinness, the knight who made her life. Quietly difficult 8 men. 8 documented stories. And now we arrive at the name on this list that will stop you completely. Not the studio chief who tried to cage her. Not the husband who raised his fists. Not the director she loved and lost and could never quite stop reaching for. Not the leading man who lashed out at her on a film set and ended everything between them in a single second. After all of that, the name that changes everything is a knighted British actor known throughout the world for his restraint, his intelligence, and his almost unimpeachable dignity, Sir Alec Guinness. By the time Davis mentioned him in a 1972 interview, Guinness was one of the most celebrated actors in the English-speaking world. The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957 had earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor. Kind Hearts and Coronets, in which he had played 8 separate characters with such technical precision that critics struggled to find adequate language for what they had witnessed, had established him as among the most gifted performers of his generation. He was knighted. He was admired. He was, in the imagination of the audience that encountered his work, a figure of almost unimpeachable dignity and grace. He was not the kind of man you expected to find on a list like this, which is exactly why Davis put him there. In 1959, Davis and Guinness were cast together in a film called The Scapegoat, based on a novel by Daphne du Maurier. The premise was an intriguing one. An Englishman on holiday in France discovers his exact physical double and finds himself gradually assuming the other man's identity and life. Guinness played both roles. Davis played his mother, an aristocrat of considerable decay and force, who had become dependent on a prescribed substance to manage her circumstances. It was the kind of role she understood completely. A woman whose power was concentrated precisely because everything around her was collapsing. Davis understood those women. She had spent her career playing them, and in some ways, she had spent her life being one. The production was not a happy one. The film was considered a disappointment upon its release, and critical opinion, then and since, has been that it failed to realize what the source material and the casting had promised. Davis herself, in the same interview where she named Guinness, offered her own diagnosis. She said it was a very bad film, that Guinness was never meant to play a straight part, and that the whole situation was simply unfortunate. She was not attempting to frame the experience as Guinness's fault. She was trying, with visible effort, to be fair. And then she said what she had experienced directly. "He wasn't very pleasant to me," she told the interviewer. "He made it difficult for me." Those words, from Bette Davis, carry weight precisely because of who is saying them. This was a woman who had been made to endure difficulty by directors with absolute institutional power, by husbands who expressed their inadequacy physically, by a studio system designed to keep her from being what she was. When she said that a co-star made it difficult for her, she was not describing sensitivity. She was describing documented professional conduct. And she was saying it about a man the world had decided was the very model of civilized, gracious professionalism. The gap between that reputation and Davis's experience of him is the chapter. But then she did something that distinguishes this entry from every other on the list. She offered him an explanation, one she was careful to present as possibility rather than conclusion. And who knows why he did, she said. Often actors are going through something difficult and they're just not in a very good mood. And with me, he was not in a very good mood. Read that carefully. Davis, who owed Guinness nothing in the way of charitable interpretation, who had named far more powerful men with far less grace, offered the possibility that his behavior toward her had a cause she didn't know, a circumstance she wasn't party to, a difficulty of his own that had simply overflowed onto her. She didn't know if that was true. She said she didn't know if that was true, but she offered it anyway. Guinness was, during the period of their working together, navigating the particular complexity of a man whose private identity was in permanent tension with his public reputation. A deeply private person in ways that had significant personal dimensions that the era offered him no safe language for. Whether any of this contributed to his behavior toward Davis on that production is something the historical record does not resolve. Davis suggested it might. She left it there as a possibility without claiming it as a fact. Now consider what this moment reveals. Not about Guinness, but about Davis. She had named a studio chief who tried to legally own her. She had named husbands who raised their hands against her. She had named directors who looked straight at what she offered and chose not to see it. She had named the man she loved most in the world as a tyrant, without flinching from either word. And here, at the end of the list, she named a British knight who had made her professional life quietly and deliberately difficult. And then, in the same breath, opened a door for him that he had never asked her to open. She named 9 men. She documented what each of them had done or failed to do or taken from her without permission. And at the end, she left a door open, not wide open, not in a way that erased what she had said, but open enough to suggest that even after everything, the tyranny and the dismissal and the legal battles and the marriages that each cost her something she could not get back, she maintained the capacity to consider that the people who had treated her badly might have been carrying something she couldn't see. That is not a small thing. For a woman who had been given every reason in the world to close every door permanently, it is perhaps the largest thing of all. What stays with you, after all 9 names, is not the anger, it is the precision. It is, Davis knew exactly what each man had done, exactly what it cost her, and exactly how much of it she was willing to say out loud. She named the ones who deserved it. She protected the ones she chose to protect. And at the very end, she extended grace to a man who never asked for it. Because that too was who she was. She decided what the record said, on her terms, until the end. If this film has given you even a fraction of what Davis's own words have always given the people lucky enough to encounter them, share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood as much as you do. And if you want more stories like this one, the ones behind the glamour, the ones Hollywood never put in the press notes, subscribe to Golden Age Files. We'll be here. This is Golden Age Files, where the stories behind the glamour are always more extraordinary than the glamour itself. Until next time.